Welcome to American Issues Take One. I'm Tim Apicella, your host. My co-host for the day is Jay Fidell, CEO of ThinkTech Hawaii. We have Ben Davis, University of Toledo School of Law, David Larson, professor of Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, and Jean Rosenfeld, scholar and Middle East expert. George Bush Sr., back in January 12, 1991, felt it was very important to talk to Congress and get their buy-off before we invaded Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm. He did this and got full congressional support from the Senate and the House. Fast forward, President George Bush Jr. sought to invade Iraq in 2002. 77 senators and 296 House representatives debated and approved Operation Iraqi Freedom. So where does that put Donald Trump as far as trying to speak with Congress and get a formal approval to invade another country? Well, I don't think that happened. He said that they complied with the law. Secretary Rubio said, we fully complied with the War Power Act, and that was to consult the Gang of Eight, Republicans and Democrats, and they said they fully complied. Donald Trump bombed another country and started a war. Trump's words, Hegseth's words, war. Yet we know that the War Power Act of 1973 was designed to place limits on the President of the United States to start a war. So the War Power Act seems to be, at this point, a joke. And when should Congress step in and fully authorize a war before the war starts? That's part of the topic of today's show. And Jay, straight to you, if I may. The War Powers Act is a worthless attempt, I think, in my opinion, to limit the president to engage a nation into war. What purpose does the Wars Power Act serve if a president just simply goes around it by saying, oh, this was a military action, the bombing of Iran, and that doesn't constitute a war, yet he says it's a war every time he gets in front of a microphone. Your thoughts?
It is a war, no question about that. Everyone calls it a war. But what I find interesting is that he's using it as a distraction. We should discuss this. And the distraction is from everything that's happening domestically and in other places in the world. And so I see there's a kind of a rotation between the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern, the European hemisphere. And so he's distracting us as much as he possibly can. But one question that occurs to me, Tim, relative to your discussion is that suppose Congress did, in fact, have a vote now. And they said, no war under the War Powers Act, no war. We do not authorize it. You are prohibited from having a war. Wow, what happens then? I suggest to you that he would ignore Congress completely, even though they passed legislation specifically indicating that he was to stop. He would veto it or he would ignore it. What do you think?
Jay, let me follow up on that because we heard Marco Rubio say explicitly that this president and previous presidents feel that the War Power Act is unconstitutional and they don't need to follow it. But Rubio in the same breath said, but we followed it and complied with it completely.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time you had inconsistent statements on major issues from different members of the cabinet. At the end of the day, Trump rules.
Yeah, but their philosophy is that it's unconstitutional, so why have the need to follow it? There's your answer.
I'll go further. I'll go to the point of asking whether the Supreme Court would agree with that legislation, would agree that this is an unconstitutional war. Suppose they do that. Suppose on some immediate litigation, the Supreme Court holds that this is war and that it is unconstitutional. Would Trump follow it then? And I give you my answer, no, he wouldn't, because he doesn't abide by either Congress or the Supreme Court.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Hey, Ben, again, going back to Secretary Rubio, and Trump said they fully complied with the War Power Act. And by simply informing the Gang of Eight, that was a satisfaction of their obligation to the War Power Act. Yet, at the microphone, Donald Trump fully acknowledged that A, it is a war, not a military action. B, that I got him, meaning Khamenei, I got him before he got me, or I had a feeling that Israel was going to attack Iran, and so I felt it was better to, initiate a bombing against Iran before they did so against the United States. Where does this all shake out, Ben?
If we start from the point of view of international law and the law of war, right? The basic view is that this is an illegal war simply because it's not a war of self-defense. Now, we can play games with wording as a matter of domestically, whether it's military objective or whatever, right? But I think that any normal view of an international armed conflict, the definition of armed conflict, we are in an armed conflict. We may not use the word war, but we're using we are in an armed conflict, which triggers the application of international law of war, humanitarian law. Okay, so we're in a war. So whatever Trump says makes no difference. And it's an illegal war. It's an aggressive war, no matter what he says, that the other guy was going to get him, or that if we didn't do it, Israel was going to do it before. So the point of the matter is that it's an illegal war. As a matter of, it's an aggressive war, by the way. And aggressive war is Ben Ferencz, who is the one of the last surviving Nuremberg prosecutors, says it is the worst kind of international crime. Why? Because it contains in it all of the other ones: war crimes, crime against humanity. So we are in an aggressive war. There's no way about it. Now, getting on the domestic side of these things, you have a government at present, as we know, both domestically and internationally, that is, in terms of dealing with domestic stuff and stuff under the Constitution, that is basically trying to extract itself from law and say that it is doing policy. So in other words, the World Powers Resolution is unconstitutional, but as a policy, we complied with it. Well, that gets into the space of discretion of the head of state. And there's a lot of this discretion of the head of state stuff that's going on right now, as part of this, essentially extreme right fascist plan. That's the way I see it. By the way, for the distraction part of it, let's just call it, I mean, this is pretty cynical, but Epic Fury EF or Epstein Files EF, that's kind of in your face, pretty clear in terms of the naming of it for anybody who sort of plays with words. In addition, you got little games being played, like, for example, in the elections that just happened in Texas. The Attorney General of Texas apparently did not update the maps that's for the redistricting areas, so people showed up in Dallas to vote, and based on old maps, because the maps had not been put in place properly by the Attorney General. Mistake was made. Yes, right, sure. So a state judge, goes ahead and says, we extend for 2 hours, so because of the confusion caused by this. And then what happens is those folks who voted after 7 o'clock, guess what? The Supreme Court of Texas says, no, you couldn't have done that. So don't count any vote after 7 o'clock. Anybody who was not in line before 7 o'clock. That happened, but it's a distraction, right? And we don't know about it. And then, of course, we've got all the stuff with regards to Gaza. If I can mention it again, anybody, hello, Gaza is still going on. It's been shut down. Providing humanitarian aid to the people in there has been shut down. Can I talk to you about foreigners in the United States?
Ben, I hear you, and I think it goes to what Jay said at the last show, and that is Donald Trump keeps as many plates in the air spinning on a stick as he possibly can. I wouldn't be surprised if Cuba's next. So anyway, Ben, thank you so much. And David, to you. David, going to you, we have roving explanations, particularly from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that this war is a result of the goal to remove ballistic missiles from Iran, to remove all nuclear capabilities as far as nuclear bombs from Iran. Yet we have Donald Trump saying, no, this is about regime change, or I got to get him before he gets me. How is Congress going to deal with all these multiple explanations as far as a rationale to war, a very serious war? How are they going to line up? And I think the Senate actually meets today to discuss this very thing. So what's your opinion about what Congress is going to do on all these multiple explanations?
Well, theoretically, there are several things Congress can do. One is they can decide to pass a war powers resolution rejecting Trump's authority to call this war. But the problem with that is that can be vetoed. And it can be vetoed very easily and quickly and require 2/3 to override the veto. And that's not going to happen. Second thing Congress does, again, theoretically have power of the purse, but in this administration, we don't see them exercising that very often. They basically ceded authority of the purse to the president, but they could stop appropriating the war. That's something they could do. But what will happen then is they'll be charged with abandoning the troops. That'll be so politically unpopular that they're not going to do that. They can impeach the president. The War Powers Resolution in 1973 says there's only 3 times you can act unilaterally if there's a declaration of war, which we don't have. If you have specific statutory authorization to make the attack, which the president did not have, or there's been an attack upon the United States, which hasn't happened. So the president doesn't have authority to go into this law to start this war. It is a violation. You could start a legal action, but again, we've got a court system that has not been has been unwilling, basically, to rule against this president, and has, again, kind of embraced this idea of a very expansive idea of presidential authority. So there's legal violations and legal violations, but is the court going to do anything about it? Because I think we have an express legal violation. It's very clear. But would the court do anything about it? So there's a lot of confusion, and it's troubling on so many levels. When Trump ran for president, remember, no foreign wars, no regime change. We're not going to do any of those things. And now he's doing those things. He criticized, remember Afghanistan and the withdrawal of troops, and when everybody was trying to leave the country. And look at the chaos now. There were no plans to get the American citizens out of Iran and even the Middle East. So it's like things are falling apart on many different levels. And the problem is, again, we've got this kind of a Congress of sycophants who have the power to intervene and to stop things that are going on, but they just won't exercise that power.
Donald Trump has had the luxury of getting Congress to rubber stamp anything he wants. So other than the Epstein Transparency Act, which Donald Trump didn't appreciate, but Congress for once stood up and stood against Donald Trump's whims and wishes, it's unlikely that Congress is going to do anything that opposes what Donald Trump has started. We'll see. I guess we'll see what the Senate says and how that debate goes. So thank you, David. Appreciate it very much. Hey, Gene. Hey, we got two countries that have been at each other's throats for over 40 years, since the late 1970s. We had 2 countries that were deeply involved with quote unquote negotiations on basically how to remove nuclear capability and weapons from Iran. All reports was that there was progress. There were general terms that were being met, that they were being agreed to, and they were moving forward. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump, in my opinion, sucker punched Iran in the middle of peace negotiations. I mean, that's highly unusual to do something like that. Let's face it, Bush Sr., Bush Jr. made it very clear that future negotiations with Iraq and Saddam Hussein was fruitless. They made those announcements very clearly. They broke off those discussions, and they went to Congress after that fact to get authorization for a military intervention. Donald Trump didn't do any of that. He just sucker punched Iran. What ramifications does that have in the future when the United States engages in peace talks with another nation? I wouldn't trust the United States. And why would any country trust us when we're in the middle of trying to resolve a problem diplomatically, and out of the blue, we sucker punch them? Your thoughts?
As you know, this president is conducting foreign policy just as oddly as he is conducting domestic policy, and he is favoring military solutions, hard power. He is taking away our soft power capabilities by sidelining the State Department and focusing on the Department of War. And that is the sign of an imperial presidency, which he's taking on the foreign stage to act very much like Putin did in Ukraine. There were no negotiations going on then, but it definitely was an aggressive move. Now, you can argue that Iran and the United States were in a state of war at the time the negotiations were taking place because of the strike, the 12-day strikes in June, and see this as a follow-up. After engaging in talks, you can say there was a pause in this operation, call it what you will, and there were talks to see if Iran was sincere in negotiating, and then taking under advisement during this quote-unquote pause. They were not. It was not a sucker punch, but it was preemptive, because another excuse they've had for this is that Iran was planning to attack the United States and was on the brink of a nuclear weapon. So it becomes, in other parlance about operations and non-wars that are wars, it becomes preemptive. And there was a preemptive doctrine developed under George Bush. You may remember George W. Bush. And under that preemption, it increased presidential power to actually start something. And he did with Iraq, although he did have a discussion with the nation at the United Nations and with Congress. This president is overturning precedent. Something occurs to me here. Supposing we had a constitutional crisis and nobody came. That's where we are. We are beyond the constitutional crisis. He has used the military and scuttled the Posse Comitatus Act in Minneapolis. And now he is paying absolutely no attention to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So there we are. And you can compare this to a lead up of World War II. This is what frightens me. When you have an imperial president who's gone off the rails, that the Japanese did attack the United States here in Pearl Harbor, where I am in Honolulu, while negotiations were going on in Washington with diplomats from Japan with the Roosevelt administration. Here, yes, he kept warning Iran, and I think Iran was not surprised that they were attacked, but that they were attacked in broad daylight. But this kind of boldness is part and parcel of an imperial presidency, which in other words, we can call a strongman presidency. And that's where we are beyond a constitutional crisis, in my opinion.
Let me ask you this. Were these quote unquote peace talks or negotiations just a cover to an already predetermined outcome? They were just a facade that we were going to do what we were going to do, and the peace talks were just basically a facade?
Technically, no, because it had Iran caved and said, no, we will not ever develop a nuclear bomb, and you can have all the inspections you want, then they would have fallen back on the fact that Israel weighed in and said, no, that's not good enough. We have to get rid of your missile production too. And if Iran had said, okay, that's fine, we'll get rid of our missile production, just let our government stay in place, please. Technically, they probably would have stood down Hegseth and Trump. But they knew that wasn't going to happen. That isn't realistic. And Iran would never do it because Iran is conducting holy war. That's another aspect. They don't appreciate the fact that the most difficult type of war to engage in is holy war. It's unlimited. It doesn't conform to rules, any rules that have ever been developed about the conduct of war. And Hegseth has mirrored that by saying, forget the rules of engagement. We're really there to kill people. The military is a lethal force, and that's why we employ it, and we're going to get our own way.
Great points, Jean. Thank you. Jay, you mentioned earlier in your first comment, this is a distraction. We've talked about that movie that occurred during the Clinton era, The Tail That Wags the Dog with Dustin Hoffman. And it was, let's create a war in order to distract the American public. Cuba has been, basically, there's a countrywide oil embargo of Cuba. He's basically doing the strangulation of Cuba to what ends. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it's regime change. But if you're Cuba or if you're another nation that's on Donald Trump's enemies list, should they be preparing for war?
Or preparing to capitulate, one or the other. I think Cuba is on his list, but there are others on his list. And each time it's more of a threat to the rest of the people, the rest of the countries on the list. I agree that Cuba is the next. And when he does Cuba, and it's easy. Cuba is easy. There's no real defense there. They don't have the resources or the military or oil. So what is going to happen is he's going to take them over overnight. As soon as he needs another distraction, he will take over Cuba. But looking at the long picture on this, the long throw on it, each time he does this, he's more powerful. Each time he does this, the countries that are mentioned in his rhetoric, in his hit list rhetoric, are more concerned. Not that they can really defend against the military, which has over $1 trillion of resources from Congress, but because he can control them, and they will not be able to fight back. And so they will have to make a deal. That this is deal making to the nth degree, deal making by violence. And so I think we can see this in the larger picture as one step along the way of becoming a global tyrant, a global despot. That doesn't help the country at all. What really amazed me was that NATO shot down a missile headed to Turkey, which is a NATO member. Although Turkey is very sympathetic to Trump, and my guess is it's sympathetic to Trump's war in Iran. So what is going on here? Why would NATO defend the United States, essentially? All of a sudden, all these countries in NATO who have been insulted and abused, they turn around and they defend against an attack on Trump, essentially. So I don't know what's going on.
Do you agree with Jean that Donald Trump is acting as a worldwide imperial president? That, we're going 2,000 years back to imperial Rome?
Jean, by the way, I agree with everything you said. Every single thing. The question here is, if you go without congressional approval, if you go without the approval of the government in general, where do you wind up? It's a diving board, and you're going off the deep end. And like Rome, it can't last. And I would say that he's headed for a huge global disaster, a disaster of the United States on the global stage. It won't take that long. He's already, lost all the allies. He's inflamed the entire Middle East. Even in the United States, there, a lot of people will disagree. Although I have to say that a lot of people, including people in Hawaii, there was a story about a poll in the Star Advertiser yesterday, day before, about how most people in Hawaii agree with Trump's attack on Iran. And why? Is because he's selling it as, let's get the bad guys. And they have been hearing about the bad guys for a long time. And indeed, Iran has been replete with bad guys doing bad things. So what he's doing is using that as a lever, political lever, if you will. So I think even in the United States, they're going to turn away from it if he starts losing, or it becomes so confusing that nobody knows which end is up. I think this is not sustainable. It is not sustainable on the global stage. It is not sustainable in the Middle East. It is not sustainable in the United States. And one day soon, it's going to collapse, and it's going to be his biggest mistake. One more point is that tomorrow we are doing a show on the attack on Pearl Harbor, which arguably was the worst mistake the Japanese could have made. And we are going to examine, their decision process, why they decided to attack Pearl Harbor, how they try to deceive everyone in these phony negotiations they were having in Washington that Jean referred to, and why it was a mistake not to go bigger, because they had a plan. Yamamoto had a plan, and his plan was to actually occupy Hawaii. So this touch and go kind of attack, which is what Trump's doing, this non-boots on the ground attack, which is what Trump's doing, is really a huge, big mistake. And at the end of the day, that kind of mistake will be very costly. It was for the Japanese, for sure. So I suggest to you, this is a touch and go attack. He's not going to put boots on the ground, and he's going to lose everyone's sympathy sooner or later.
Okay. Ben, to Jay's point about picking fights with everyone, Spain wasn't very happy about the idea of letting the military use its real estate for staging. And what did Donald Trump do? Said, I'm going to cut all trading with Spain, a NATO partner. I think Spain may have reversed its course on that. I'm not 100% sure. So Donald Trump, once again, has intimidated one of our NATO partners, our longtime ally, and has bullied them into a point of submission. Who else, if it's not Spain, what other NATO ally that now needs to respond to this potential expanding war with Iran? How many other countries is he going to alienate if he doesn't get exactly what he wants when he wants it?
There are a couple of different things that might be thought about. One is that even if a country is not supporting what's happening, they do still have their right to self-defense. So, for example, when the Iranian missile goes into Turkey, Turkey has the right to defend itself against that attack. Similarly, I think the French aircraft carriers going into the region, there's concerns about French citizens, there's concerns about British citizens. There's an attack on a British base in Cyprus. Again, the Brits could assert self-defense to protect themselves. So that's how a lot of these countries could potentially come into this in a mode of self-defense against things that are happening to their people or to their bases, etc., their property and things like that. But with respect to the Trump intimidation tactics, I think that the Europeans have, and I think around the world, quite honestly, they have diagnosed Trump's approach as being the, what is it? Speak loudly and carry a big stick, okay? As opposed to speak quietly and carry a big stick, which I think was Theodore Roosevelt back in the day. So the thing is that I don't buy the fact that the Spaniards will look at this and get quaking in their boots about him making bluster at them. Because remember, Spain also has its democratic reality of how the Spanish people think. And their government is reacting to what they're seeing. And I think that they've been very suspicious of everything that happened in Gaza. They're not buying this Iranian story and all of that. So, the Spaniards, I think, will use whatever levers they have to counter this. But I'm not worried about the Spaniards sort of caving to Trumpian bluster. What I'm more worried about is if it doesn't go the way that Trump wants it to go, doesn't go the way Netanyahu wants it to go, how far are these people willing to go in their craziness? Because I am certainly going to say here today, would not be surprised if at some point, if it's not going the way they want, somebody gets a bright idea to try to use a nuclear weapon. And I'm not necessarily on Tehran, but somewhere in there, because the people in this don't calculate what that means very well. They don't think very well. And so that's the level of fear I have in terms of us getting into a situation like that along the way down the road. And that is the kind of watershed moment, I would say, that might cause a lot of reaction around the world to what Trump is doing. The other thing I would just like to mention is the CIA is talking to the Kurds to try to get the Kurds to do some kind of ground thing in Iran, and in fact they're talking to the Iraqi Kurds to try to have them help support the CIA efforts with the Kurds. Well, as you all know, the Kurds are all over the place. They are in Turkey too. In fact, there's been a lot of problems for Turkey with the Kurds for many, many years, right? What is the Kurdish dream? A Kurdistan, right through all of them. And just imagine that the Kurds once again get that dream going and weapons to be in the middle of this. Because the Kurds have a long-standing group. They even have a national anthem, by the way. You can get it. You can listen to it on YouTube. So just remember this bright idea that somebody, just like a Dean Acheson back in the day with Mossadegh, this bright idea to do this war, and then we're going to arm the Kurds, and they're going to be the spark. Good luck.
Ben, we've stabbed the Kurds in the back so many times. Why would they listen to us about acting up in Iran? That may be, a pipe dream come true. I don't know. Maybe you're right.
But it's a strong Kurd feeling from everything I've seen. The strong, it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. Maybe this is a chance we can get. Iran is a little weak. Iraq's a little there. Hey, let's take our shot.
Once you've been stabbed in the back a few times, you change your opinion. Thank you, Ben. David, I want to go to one of Ben's points, and that is the expansion of this war. And he mentioned nuclear material. Does this war that we now have, does this thing expand exponentially? Or after a couple of weeks, does it kind of simmer or go from a boil to a simmer? No, again, Iran has a lot of nuclear material. You don't have to have a fully tipped nuke to cause a lot of problems with a dirty bomb that has nuclear material in it. And a dirty bomb is probably just as easy to deploy than any other kind of bomb, but I'm not an expert in such things. Your thought about expansion of this war or retraction of it?
Yeah, as Ben was talking, that was one of the thoughts I had was, what we do know is Donald Trump can't tolerate losing. I'll do anything to prevent the perception that I've lost. And even if I have to deploy a nuclear weapon to avoid that perception, I guess I'll do it, because I can't lose. So Iran is not Venezuela. You've got a population that has a dedication to a religion and a value system that they would like to spread across the globe. And there's no cost that can't be paid for that, and the ultimate cost is rewarded with martyrdom. So when Alex Preddy was murdered and Renee Good was shot, the characterization by Vance and Chrissy Nome was that they were domestic terrorists. Well, now we're going to get some real domestic terrorists. One of the fears I have is that there's going to be retaliation. We're already seeing retaliation throughout the Middle East. That there'll be some retaliation here within the United States. there's going to be costs to this that people are overlooking. 3 jets went down. What's the cost of those 3 jets? They're tremendously expensive. How many children could you have fed with the cost of those 3 jets? A girls' school was hit, and we don't know how many girls were killed. But there's going to be a significant humanitarian loss. There's a loss in terms of our international allies and their unwillingness to go to some of the extent that I think Donald Trump is willing to go. I'm concerned that there will be an escalation. I don't see how you just walk away from this, and I don't think Iran's going to just walk away from it. I think that this will continue, and God forbid that we send people in person into Iran, and that's going to cause so many deaths and so many tragedies.
Jean, I saved this question for you. U.S. commanders are telling their troops that Trump has been anointed by Jesus, and it's Jesus wants Donald Trump to wage war on Iran, and that is part of God's divine plan. You're an expert in religion in the Middle East, and to what degree is this Christian nationalist tone being slapped on our troops and being broadcast on certain news media? How problematic is that as it pertains to this war that we're currently in? If our United States commanders are saying that this is all according to Armageddon and Jesus' plan, and Donald Trump is the instrument to bring on Armageddon. Your thoughts?
Since Mark Kelly and his fellow congressmen and senators warned the soldiers not to obey illegal orders, I think the response to that by the administration was over the top. And the reason for that is that Hegseth has spent all of his time as head of the Department of War getting the soldiers and the force that he wants. So he has basically chosen white, male, Christian, non-Catholic members in the force. What I mean by that is that Americans, many Christian Americans, mostly Protestant, mostly outside the mainline churches, believe that the end times are now and that Armageddon will be fought. Now, the problem with apocalyptic myth is that it recurs every time there is a threat of major catastrophe or the end or decline of a society. And we're at that now, also near the year 2000, which reawakens the apocalyptic Christian expectation that the end is near. So what Hegseth is doing is appealing to soldiers that are Christian, that do believe that Armageddon is upon us, to fall in line and to accept any orders they are given, not to disobey. And that's one way of consolidating people, is to appeal to their emotions, but an even greater way is to appeal to their religious beliefs. We are in an apocalyptic age. I've been writing about that recently. It's very evident, and it's a very strong way to unite people behind a major operation, which I agree with everybody on this panel. The largest warning about this kind of operation, which is already a regional war and is basically at the threshold of Europe, that it expands globally, because you have to ask yourself, what if the regime in Iran does tend to fail? Who is going to come to rescue it? What will Russia and China do? Remain on the sidelines? What will other nations do? North Korea? What kind of response would Iran take in extremis? Would it actually deploy any nuclear weapon it could cobble together? We don't know the answers to these things. We do know that we just sunk a warship of Iran's in the Indian Ocean, and Sri Lanka came to its aid. So those little things with shooting down missiles in Turkey and attacking a warship in Asia has the potential to expand this. The longer this war goes on and the more things that happen, the greater is the potential for a much greater war even.
I agree, and I don't think it helps by putting a national Christian tone to it, particularly about Armageddon, because if you're a Jew in Israel, if you understand Revelations well enough, you understand that the Jewish people are the first to get wiped out. And I'm not sure that's something I'd want to have on the agenda, particularly if the United States military leaders are promoting that this is an Armageddon. But anyway, we've run out of time, Gene, and I am going to go for last thoughts. Jay, why don't we start with you?
You know, when we had this discussion before this war began, we were kind of mixed on whether he would do it or not do it. We were not unified in our expectations, but now it's very clear that we are unified in the expectation this will grow, this will become worse. And the American people, the War Powers Act doesn't mean anything here. American people will support it because he's been setting it up that way. And we will have a larger war, and it could go beyond the region. In fact, some people think it's World War III, or the threshold to World War III right now, today, as we speak. But my last thought to suggest to you guys is the opportunistic aspect of this. We've seen Putin attack a sovereign nation right across the border. We saw Trump attack a sovereign nation in Venezuela. We see Trump now, there are other examples too, but we see Trump now attacking arguably a sovereign nation in Iran. And it ain't like it used to be. Apparently you can do this. So if you're Russia, you say, I guess that's what we can do now. And nobody can criticize us for attacking a sovereign nation across the border. Trump doing it all the time. And China, who has been eyeing Taiwan for a very long time, could say the same thing. Everybody doing it. We can do it too. And so I think we have a general breakdown of the post-World War II liberal world order. And it's happening right in front of our face with the agreement and consent, implicit consent of Congress and the country. So we're really in for some hard times. And those hard times will affect every American, maybe every country, maybe everyone in the world. So it's not limited to a regional war or potentially a World War III. It's going to affect the whole world.
All righty. Ben, your thoughts?
This is just going to be a lot of death, a lot of people dying. Just keep that in mind. A lot of people dying, and this was not something that needed to be done at this time. And that's the one of the tragedies of the choices that this administration is making, and that the American people made. Around the world, the basic attitude is like, I don't care who you voted for. It's your problem, the Trump administration, Americans, so you fix it. And to the extent that this particular group at the top is willing to act like gangsters, gangster government, if Americans acquiesce to that, there'll just be lots and lots of death. By the way, in the United States too, not necessarily from the terrorist acts, more from things like people not having health care, people not having this because money's going to be spent on the other stuff. And, they're just the people that you don't see who just disappear at some point. So it's just a period of a lot of death, and trying to find a way to some kind of light to get this into a more sane mode. I don't know if there's anybody out there who's able among the heads of states to do that, but it's a time for really clear minds to think through it and come up with ways to tone this all down.
Righty. David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One is that one thing we can do, people like us can do, is connect the dots. Make sure that people understand what the consequences of what's happening are. I mean, what does it mean for our healthcare system? What does it mean for our global energy costs? Remind people of the costs, what's happening here, of the lives that are being lost, has been refers to. So that's one thing we have a responsibility to do, is to make sure people understand all the costs that are involved when something like this happens. And secondly, and maybe more importantly, is don't let Trump take control of the elections for November. I mean, it's percolating, and he's talking about a draft executive order where he's going to nationalize the elections, and we can't let that happen. And we keep talking about distractions. This is a distraction from that movement that's going on right now, and we've got to stay focused on that also.
Great point, David. Thank you. Gene, I want you to have the final word. Go ahead.
I want to focus on something one of our greatest historians and scholars said this morning, Timothy Snyder. He made a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. He said, patriotism is love of your country, and you would sacrifice for the love of your country. Nationalism is focused on dominating, on your sovereignty, on your country becoming the dominant power. The distinction between power and love we've met before. We met it in the fight against fascism in Nazi Germany. That Second World War generation is dying out, as is our notion of defeating fascism. In fact, to use an old adage, Donald Trump is seizing victory from the jaws of defeat. The defeat of fascism in World War II now becomes the implement, the tool for the victory of American nationalism as we continually engage in aggressive operations against other nations.
Well said. Thank you, Gene. We're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank my co-host, Jay Fidell. I'd like to thank Ben Davis, David Larson, and Jean Rosenfeld. Thank you very much for participating. I'm Tim Apicella, your host, and this episode has been called The U.S. Powers Act is a Joke, Attacking Iran. Trump Ignores Congress. That's it for American Issues Take One. Won't you join us next time? And until then, aloha.